and also start the preparation for when we loop it later on. In Cinema 4D, we eventually want to end up with something like this, where we have this character walking through this scene that we are going to build around the character. And because this is a loop animation, it involves quite a lot of precision in how we set all of this up. And one of those things that will need to be very precise is the distance that the character walks throughout the scene. So as we go through the various lessons, all of this will start to add up, but we just need to do a lot of preparation to get to this point. So as far as that relates to the character model itself, let's start by creating a new project. And we are going to bring our character into this, but before anything else, the frames per second of our project right now is at 30. This needs to be 24, and that's going to be our frames per second for the rest of the project. If you can't see these project settings, just press Ctrl and D to bring those up and change the FPS right there. And then we can go to File, Merge Objects, and we want to find our character. I have the character which I exported from Fuse, and I have the normal version first. This box is going to pop up. Just click OK. Here we are. This is the character with that basic walk cycle. The process for importing the character from Mixamo, though, one of those characters which is pre-made, is slightly different. This part is the same. The FBX import window will show up once again, and I can click OK. But we also have this extra pop-up talking about do you want to reassign included takes, and this refers to what's called the take system in Cinema 4D. Now, it's not relevant to this class, so I won't really go into too much detail, but here you just want to make sure you click no, and your character will be imported just the same. So I can just temporarily disable the Fuse character, and let's just take a look at the character from Mixamo. You can see it has the same exact same animation, it's just a different model. I can see though that the hair has not imported correctly. This is the material for this character. Interestingly, the character from Mixamo has a single material, whereas the one from Fuse is broken up into different bits. But that makes sense because we configured the clothes and the shoes and all of that stuff differently. So that makes sense. The hair for this character did not come out correctly, so let's just take a look at why that's happening. In the material for this character, I can see that the alpha channel is what's responsible for the hairstyle. It does need to be enabled, but we also need to enable this image alpha switch so that Cinema 4D correctly interprets what's going on here. And when I do a quick render, you can see the hair now looks correct. So if you run into the same issue, you know how to quickly fix that. Anyway, that's all I will say about the characters from Mixamo. I am going to continue on the project with my custom character from Fuse, but I just wanted to highlight the import process and that section about the take system, and also if you have any problems with the hair material. So to continue, let's call this character walk number 1. And the distance we want this character to walk is 2500 centimeters in our scene, or 25 meters in real scale. These characters are to scale, so we are going to be speaking in those terms throughout this class. Anytime we create any object, it is actually going to be to actual scale. So let's have a plane to use as a reference for the distance. In the size, I will set the X size to 2500 centimeters. And you can see it's much larger now. Let's go to display and do growth shading with lines so we can see the segments. Just helps with the overall preview. I am going to move this into Z space so that its edge over here starts in the center of our scene. And we are going to build everything else in the scene into the Z space. So the exact position for this needs to be half its Z size, which is 2500. So if I just type in here 2500 for the position divided by 2, I get exactly 1250. And now this lines up perfectly with the center of my scene. You can see my character is actually moving in the wrong direction. And I guess you could build into the negative Z space, but I like to just build that way and also that way. It's just a good practice. To fix this, I'm going to create a new null object. Let's call this one walk number 1. Take everything at frame 0. Let's put our character under this null object. And this is going to be rotated 180 degrees. If I hold shift as I rotate this, it locks the rotation segments so I can easily select 180, just like that. So now my character is walking in the correct direction. But we can see that there is only a single walk cycle, and it's very short. It stops after about 1.5 seconds, maybe not even that much. So we need to continue this animation until the character reaches this point. So to fix this, we need to go to the timeline window, and it's this first one right here. Window, timeline dope sheet. We can see the keyframes that make up our animation. They go from frame 0 to just past 1 second. This is the same object that we are seeing over here, this bone structure. So to extend this animation, we select the main object, which in turn selects everything else underneath. And over here in the attributes, we can now see the properties for this keyframe track. Anytime you have keyframes running like this, it's called a keyframe track. And we have some controls for what we can do with this particular track. And what we want to control is what happens after it plays for the first time. So this after control, it's set to constant right now, which basically means that nothing happens. But we can change this to repeat, and we can set the number of repetitions. So let's just throw in a number here like 20. If I just maybe move this out of the way temporarily and hit play, now you can see the character is repeating that initial walk cycle. So that's the first step. Of course, we need this to repeat and continue in that direction instead of just jumping back to the initial point. So let's set our timeline to be longer. It's still just the default 3 seconds. Let's set this to, let's say, 20 seconds. That will give us enough time for the character to reach that point over here. Let's bring back our timeline. We do want to repeat all of these keyframe tracks except for one of them, which is the position in Z. So if I open this main level joint and go to its position Z and open that in turn, you can also see what's happening here is the original keyframes are these orange and blue lines, right? These orange dots and blue line. And the repetitions here are represented by the black lines which come after that. So this is repeating and jumping back to its initial position. And it keeps doing that as many times as we set over here. So what we want to do is, instead of repeating this particular keyframe track, this one needs to be repeat and offset at the same time. So we choose this option, and you can see now, instead of jumping back to the beginning, this is just continuing on. And we can't see it past this section here, but we can clearly see that's what's happening. This is now continuing whilst everything else is basically repeating and jumping back to the same place as before. But when I do that, with the Z position offset repeating, we now have the character walking continuously. And we need to measure when the character hits this particular point. It happens at about 18 seconds or so. Let's just double check. In the timeline window itself, if we navigate in this and change the repetitions, I want to see at which point we need to extend our timeline to be, or perhaps shorten it. So I can choose to either lower the repetitions and then cut off my timeline about here. That seems to be the best position closest to that point. So let's do that. That's about 19 seconds and 3 frames. I can just lower this total duration to that point, and always just give myself an extra frame of space past the last point where the keyframes lead up to. This is too close to this. Let's just give it one more frame, and I know this is going to work. So now if I close the timeline and play this again, when we get to the end, the character is roughly in this location. So whilst this is close enough or perfectly fine for a normal animation, when creating loops, we need to be extremely precise, as I've already mentioned before. So we would actually want our character to be at this point when he crosses over the edge of this particular plane. And right now he's just past there. This is where our second character is going to help us. So the one where the character just stays in place. If we bring that in, and we can click no for the assigned takes, and I think that's the wrong character there. I need the fuse version. So if we click in place, and here we go. We will give this the same treatment. Let's call this walk number 2. And let's create a null object and place our character in there and flip it 180 degrees. Let's hide the first character for a moment, and we can see that the second character also just has that initial walk cycle which finishes very quickly. So in the timeline, let's go to walk number 2, and we want to repeat again. So the after control, this is with the main track selected, which in turn selects everything else. Let's set the after control to repeat, and it's going to be 17 times, just like our first animation. I think I did something wrong there. Okay, I didn't type in 17 and hit enter. Now we see it continues. Because this is not moving in Z space, we don't need to offset the Z movement. Instead, we are going to animate the Z movement of this null object, the one that's holding the entire character. So if I got the coordinates at frame 0, I want to animate the position Z. So hold Control and click, go to the end of our animation, and set the Z position to 2500 centimeters, and then hold Control and click again to confirm that keyframe. And now if I hit play, we can see the movement into the scene is from this animation we have just created, and that's laid on top of the original animation that's on the actual character. It eases in there, so we need to go back to keyframes. I'm going to press S to contain this entire keyframe range for this position Z. Let's press S so we can see it eases in and then eases out. It should be linear with this switch over here so that the character has a constant speed throughout the entire animation. So now we have this. If I re-enable the first character, we can see that they basically move at exactly the same pace. The first character is just slightly ahead because it will overshoot the stopping point over here by just a few centimeters. But for the most part, this is basically the same animation, except that this version, which was in place to start with, we have the ability to make it stop exactly where we want, which is that point at 2500 centimeters. And so then the first character is really just a reference point of where we need to end up roughly, and then we can precisely use the second character to do that. So that's it for this lesson. With our character setup finished, we can move on to actually building the rest of the scene. So we are now going to build our scene in Cinema 4D, and this involves just taking a few assets or 3D models to start with, and then using some tools in Cinema 4D, we can actually build this into a much bigger scene. So these are the assets and 3D models we are going to use to construct our scene. It starts out just like this, and then using various tools such as cloners and effectors and so on, we can build this out into a large scene. So of course we have the telephone pole, and then we have the wooden fence, and then just a few various plants and grass that will be on the side of the road. For the road itself, we have this material, or this texture. There is a dirt road texture kinda next to the road, where our character will be walking on top of. And then we have this other dirt material for the hills and other parts of the scene. Things can get a bit disorganized in the materials section here, so what you can do is use the layer system to try and keep things more neatly organized. So if you go over to the right side of the interface, we have a layers section, and if I double click, I can create a new layer. So let's call the first one grass or plants. This is going to hold these materials, which are from these grass plants. It's hard to see because we have growth shading with lines enabled. If I go back to just growth shading, we can now see that a bit better. And that's these plants over here. So we can now drag all of these materials to that grass layer. And when I do that, you see it creates a new tab with just those materials. So let's continue with this. We have our characters, and that's this set of materials all the way down to here. And the more I do this, the more organized this is going to become. We can, let's say, do the telephone pole. That's this set of materials. You perhaps don't need to take it this far, but I just wanted to show you what's possible. And the last one I would just call scene for general scene materials. So that's our road and the dirt and so on. So now if I need to quickly jump to the materials for any of these sections, it's easy to do because it's organized like this. And I can still always just go to all and see everything at the same time. So let's start building the scene. I'm going to just hide the grass for now, and let's say basically everything else. Our characters here, I don't really need this first character anymore, so I can actually remove this completely from the scene. And in the materials section, those materials from that character remained. So if I right click anywhere, let's delete unused materials to just clean that up. We only need the materials for the one character, as we can see here. Anyway, the first element is going to be the road, which is going to just start out as a cube. Let's go to the attributes over here, and the X size is going to be 800, the Y size just 5, and the Z size is going to be 2500, which is the same length as the character moves in that direction. So the Z position of this is going to be 1 to 50, so that it starts at that point. And you see where the character walks up to. In the scene materials, I am going to apply this road material first. And I can see that it's going in the wrong direction. So what we want to do is rotate this cube 90 degrees, just like this. And we just need to reverse these sizes. So the X size is now going to be 2500 and the Z size is going to be 800. Now our material is too stretched, so we need to make some adjustments. If I go to the texture tag over here, the tiling in the hue direction is going to be changed to 2. That's going to take away some of that stretching. Also, this needs to be wider so that these lines are closer to the edge of the road. Right now it's just too narrow, this main section. So if I go back to this, the length V or tiling V needs to be adjusted. So let's use the tiling. Let's say about 0.6. These two numbers are linked together, so if you change one, the other one will change as well. So we've changed the tiling there to 0.6, which widened how the texture looks on the road. We just now need to make sure this offset is set to something which brings these lines back to their center. About negative 34% or so. We have something like this. This is a seamless material, which means you will not see any edges or borders when we tile it in this direction. So if this were, let's say, 3, there is no visible seams or edges to indicate where there is a tiling point. So that's a feature of these materials. By the way, these materials are from my material packs, which I created for Cinema 4D. If you are interested in checking these out, you can head over to my other website, motionsquared.net, and take a look there. They are for sale, but for this class, I included all the materials we are using in the class files for free. Anyway, let's continue. The next section is going to be the side of the road where our character is going to be walking over. So the width for this is going to be 500 and the height is going to be 2500. This needs to be by the side of the road. Set their position to negative 600, and I'm doing this on the left side of the road. And then the Z position once again is 1 to 50. The material is going to be this dirt material, which I will quickly apply, and it looks like I just need to reverse these scales. I keep forgetting for some reason, so just bear with me. This material is also stretched, so we need to go to the tiling. This time I will go for 4 in the tiling hue. And I also want to flip this rotation. It should be negative 90. I want this thick patches of grass to be on the outside. So that's that. We will probably adjust that later, but for now, that's okay. Our character needs to be over here somewhere. So if I go to this null object holding the character, let's move this until he is somewhere in the middle of this dirt road. It's going to be about negative 5 to 5. That's all right there. Not really in the center, but I am going to move this dirt section further in. I don't really want to see too much grass next to the actual road surface. About negative 10%. You can see it brings the texture back around over here, but by the time we place other objects there, it will not be an issue. Let's re-enable the pole, which is over here. It needs to be placed somewhere to the left. So let's say negative 1000, and the fence needs to be over here too. This is going to be at negative 900. So this piece is not long enough by itself, so we are going to clone it to create more pieces of the fence going that way. So if I take a cloner, I will hold Alt on the keyboard, or the Alt key, as I insert this, which will bring the cloner in the exact same spot as the object I had selected, which in this case was the fence. Let's call this cloner fence. And you can see by default it clones in an upward direction. So if I go to the object settings of the cloner, we can change the count and we can change the direction it's going. So right now it's going in the Y direction, which is this. We need to go in the Z direction. Now the value for this depends on the length of the fence. It is currently set at, if I click the fence and go to the size settings, we have size plus, and I can see the overall Z length is set to 625. So if I set the movement to 625, it means I can line up 4 of these perfectly, and it's going to total up to 2500 in length, which lines up with everything else we have created so far. Now that only lines up because of the preparation I did for the class. I knew this object needed to be a particular length in order to be cloned so many times and end up this exact length. Now, if your object is perhaps a bit shorter, so I am scaling this down on purpose, you would see gaps, but you can compensate for that by lowering the distance between the clones. But certain numbers will work and others will not. So 500 in this case could also work if I were to continue scaling this down and put the size. I would just type in 500 here, and it's going to contract the object, but really it will still look just fine. We just need to now have 5 clones so that we end up in the same place. So keep that in mind. Some preparation is required for everything to line up how you expect. I will keep what I had, which was a length of 625 and the same spacing for our cloner. And this is whilst we are in this per step mode and setting this up. Next up, we're going to get a landscape object, which comes in the center of the scene. This is going to be 500 in X size, 50 in height, that's the middle one there, and then 1000 in Z space. Let's go to display with lines so we can see the segments. I don't really need this much, so let's drop the width segments to 25 and the depth to 50. So we have a lot less, and the sea level is going to be 50%. This is going to be positioned at negative 1000. And let's apply this dirt material onto it. I don't need to change anything here. Let's also place this in a cloner. So if I hold the Alt key once again and insert that, the cloner will insert in that position. Let's go to the object settings, and we do want 3 clones, but we want them in that direction. Now this time I will change the mode to endpoint so that we can type out, let's say 2500. You can see it broadly fits, but we need to adjust. The starting position is going to be what you see right here. Let's say 500, and we need to lower the Z movement to 1500. So these will be intersecting with each other, but it's not a big problem. That is the design I want. And I can maybe place this below everything. So I will set the Y position to -1 so that it doesn't interfere with this other plane. Otherwise, we would get some flickering as we do some animation. So this is the same object 3 times because we've cloned it that way. I can make a copy of this, however, and change the seed each time, and I'm copying this by holding Control and just dragging down. And what we want here is a different piece of dirt each time. This is entirely optional, however, you could just use the same thing. I think in the long run, it probably will not make too much of a difference when we add all the other objects. It will kind of be covered up anyway. We can move on to the grass, which I will just start by re-enabling. And that's over here in the scene. Let's bring in a new cloner and just bring all of these in here at once. This is going to be somewhere over here, -850. And again, I know all of these numbers because I have done this project at least 2 times before. So for the movement or the mode, let's set this to endpoint so we can just set the overall height, which is going to be 2500, and then put the count up to fill up the spaces in between. So the count is going to be 200, which is quite a lot of plants. The scene at this point may start to slow down. That's normal because we have so many objects now. So to speed things up a bit, we can change the instance mode from instance to render instance. Briefly, the instancing here speeds up the scene because it treats any copies of the object as if they were the same as the original. So the amount of memory it takes up is a lot less, and that speeds up the scene. If we were using the normal instance mode instead of render instance, Cinema 4D is now calculating this as if it's actually 200 separate objects. So that's going to be slower compared to render instance, which looks at this as if it's 8 objects and their copies. So if nothing else, it's faster. If you want to read up the actual technical explanation of this, you just right-click and show help. And there is a section about this in the manual. Anyway, let's continue. Let's go back to growth shading without lines so we can see a bit better what's going on. Right now the plants are just in a straight line, so we need to go to MoGraph, Effector, and Random. And we want to play with their position, not position Y, but in position X and Z. Let's go with 200 and 200, and this is going to spread the plants out just like this. 200 might be too much. Let's maybe do 150, and I think that's okay. And to further randomize this, we can also change the clones from iterate, where it just runs through them in the order that they are, to random, and that's going to create a slightly more natural looking pattern. But that's it. With each step, we're getting closer to completing the initial block of our scene. The next thing here is to copy everything we have on this side over to the other side. So this will be done by just creating a null object and putting in everything we've built so far under this, and let's call this the left side. Now the road surface itself does not need to be part of this, so I need to just take it out. But on this left side, which if I quickly turn this on and off, you can see what that is. Hold this icon and let's get an instance, which as we've already mentioned, creates a copy. So this copy, I would just, I don't need to move it, I just need to flip it. So if I go to the coordinates, let's set the size x to -1, which would just flip this across to the other side, as if there was some kind of big mirror down the center of the scene. Comparing this to a later version of the scene, what we have just created is the initial section that the character walks through, so the distance between two telephone poles. In the following section, we will continue with this idea of expanding our scene and building it in such a way that everything is in blocks, which are easy to organize and animate later on. Before we expand the size of our scene, I would just like to quickly go over how the looping animation is going to be set up. So far we have this single section, and if I were to get another null object and place everything in here, let's call it section, and I would then take a cloner object and put everything in here. Let's set the instance mode to render instance right away, so we have better responsiveness. The count, let's just go for 10 to start with, and we want to move this in the Z direction. So in this per step mode, the position Z should be 2500, and this is going to line up this section like this and extend the length of our scene. Now you can see that the responsiveness has just been totally reduced, and that's just because of how many objects we now have in the scene, even with the render instances ticked. This is too much to handle. So what we can do is go into our setup and find the cloner for the grass and plants. This is primarily what's taking up most of the performance. So if I just hide this for now or disable the cloner for now, you will see the responsiveness will return. Okay, and if I were to get a camera and look through it using this white square, when it's white, it means we are looking through the camera, and whatever changes we make, we can see them live. So let's start by zeroing out the rotation, and the exposition should be the same as our character, which, if I recall, was 525 or -525. And the height is going to be about 75, and the distance behind our character is going to be -500. Let's set the focal length of our camera to 24 millimeters for a wider angle of view. And in the coordinates, I will put the rotation pitch, which is rotation P, to 10 degrees. So we look more up. And then what I would do here is put this as a child of the character. So when I hit play, the camera will move with the character. And because this initial block that we created is exactly the same as every clone in front of it, when we travel through one of these segments, and we do see a slight hitch at the beginning, so what I can do is take the whole thing and move it back in Z space to -2500, just to move one of these sections to be behind the character when we start, and then the rest will still begin here and continue that way. So if I play this through now, when we get to the end, it will appear as if it loops back perfectly to the start. So what we have just created is the basic setup for looping and extending the size of this scene. It loops because at the beginning, what the camera is looking at is one of these sections. So the distance between two telephone poles. If I go to grow shading with lines, you can see on the road where one section begins and where the next one starts. What the camera is looking at the beginning here is relatively the same as what it's looking at when it gets to this section. It's just the next section ahead. So I hope that makes sense. However, when we do look through the camera again, we can see two main issues. One, obviously the scene is incomplete. We need a lot more objects to the side here, which is the hills, also in the distance. And if you look very carefully, when we get to the end here, there is a slight glitch where a telephone pole just appears. It's happening because at the beginning we are looking through 9 clones, at the end just 8. So we need to hide that transition. But generally speaking, that is how we set up the loop. So that's the basis of how the loop is going to work. Let's keep this in mind as we continue to build the rest of the scene. So far we have just created this small block in our scene. We are now going to take this and make it wider. The difference between what we have here and this scene, the old one, is that we have this extra stuff at the side and in the distance. If I look out of this camera and turn off these various instances which I created, let's go to quick shading and lines. And by the way, quick shading and grow shading are the same, except that quick shading ignores any lights in the scene, whereas grow shading takes the lights into account. We'll get to that later, but for now, we can see now that the initial block or section has now been extended into 3 sections joined together. And you can clearly see because of the segments here and also the number of telephone poles. And either side of that, we have to start with these 3 smaller hills and then 2 larger ones, and then finally the largest one on the outer edge. And this is mirrored across on the other side. And all of this combined created this much larger section. And this is what I then instanced into the distance to build and set up the final version of this scene. So let's go back to where we left off. And for now, I am going to take this camera out of the same null as the character. We don't want it to move with it anymore. Let's go to this cloner. Where we had 10, we're just going to have 3. And we can move this back to start at 0, 0, 0, which is the center of the scene. So this is the start of our new bigger block. Let's go to grow shading just on its own. And I will get a plane. Let's set the width of this to something really large. Let's say 25,000. And it's also going to have a length of 2500. And let's move this to 1250. So this is going to be inside of this null object so that it gets copied across to these 3 cloners, and it's going to have the same dirt texture, except this time it needs to be mapped as cubic so we can so it doesn't get stretched out rather. And let's set the length u and v to something higher, let's say 250 on both sides. This is intersecting with the floor, so let's drop the y position to, let's say, -1, just to clean that up. This is going to be our floor. Next up, we'll get a landscape object, and the measurements for this are going to be as follows. the size X is going to be 2500. The same for the Z. So I will just copy and paste this over. And the height is going to be 500. We can apply our dirt texture to this too. We want 3 copies of this, so it will be placed inside of a cloner. I will hold the Alt key as I insert this into the scene. And 3 copies is correct, but this time I will change the mode from linear to a grid array. This allows us to have clones in 3 different directions. So we have X, Y, and Z. For X, we'll set this to 2. And for Z, let's have 3, which is the default anyway. So we will then move this to the center of our current setup, which is going to be 7500 centimeters divided by 2, because that's the total length of this current section. So divide that by 2 to be right in the middle, just like this. And I can grab one of these handles to scale this appropriately in this direction, and then grab this handle. Okay, so that handle actually just creates more clones. I think it's this one over here that scales. So you just have to be careful which one you grab. But either way, we want to create a layout like this. So that's the first set of mountains, and the positioning of this, you can just kind of just measure by eye. We want it to start just after this section. So about here is probably correct. So this will be the first set of hills. Let's make another copy. Just hold Control and drag down. This time there is only going to be 2 sets of mountains or hills. And once again, I will extend the size this way. Because these will be larger, the scale or the distance needs to be further apart. And to scale these up, I am going to go to the Transform tab of this cloner. And let's go with something like 2 for the width, which is X, and then 2 for Z as well. This means I have to readjust the overall width so it doesn't cut into this first set of hills so much. About here should work, and just make it a bit more separated. Let's say about there. If you imagine, there will be another whole section of this next to this set. So if this bleeds over, it's okay. They will kind of just join up anyway. I think about here is fine. I think the height is too low. So in the transform, once again, I will maybe go to the landscape object directly and set this height to 1000, and maybe set the Y height in the transform in the cloner to 1.5. These are the numbers I used in the original example, so I think it should work here too. And then we'll make one more copy of this. This time we are only going to have 1 clone in the Z direction, but still 2 in the X, and 1 in the Y direction, of course. Let's extend this to be out here somewhere. And for the scale X and transform, we'll maybe go with 3, the same for Z, and 4 for Y. So a much larger object. Just once again, try and position this the right amount of distance away. So it might be useful here to use some more absolute numbers so it's easy to follow. On the first set of hills, in the grid array mode here, in per step mode, the size X I will set to 5000, and size Z will be 2500. We don't have any clones in the Y direction, so this is irrelevant. Let's go to the next set. and set this size to, let's say, 12,500, just rounding down a bit. And then this other Z size, let's go for 4,500. And on the largest one, this will be 24,000 for the size X. And we only have one clone in the Z direction, so this doesn't matter. This could be 0. It won't make any difference. So this looks fine, but everything right now is too uniform. It's too neatly arranged and doesn't look very interesting. So what we need to do is to add some randomness. If I select those 3 cloners, which I will call small, medium, and large, with all 3 selected, I'm going to get a random effector, which is found under MoGraph, effector, and random. We don't want to change their position, and this is in the parameter tab. We just want to change the rotation. So let's enable rotation, and the rotation heading, RH, this should be set to 360. That will create some random rotation like we see here. Maybe it just looks a bit more natural. And we can even change the seed if we don't like the original pattern we get. So if I go to the seed in the effector tab, we can change the random result that we get. Really just about anything should be okay though. And one final adjustment here is I might just extend the width of that floor we created to be 50,000 instead. So it goes past this large hill. Okay, that's fine. And what we want to do now is take all of this and place it into a null object. This will be section large. If you recall this original section, we can call, let's say, section small. That's the initial 3, and then this one is everything combined. So with all of that done, we have now finished creating the main block section of this scene. This is what we're going to continue with for the rest of the project, and we will be lining up copies of this or instances of this in this direction, and then move our character through the whole scene